Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Tobias Heinrich. I'm an M&A partner based in Frankfurt and co-heading our European corporate M&A practice. We are here to discuss the tariffs that have recently been enacted and threatened by the new Trump administration. In fact, when preparing for this session, we have decided to broaden the lens towards not just zooming in on tariffs, but also discussing the new US economic policy more generally, where tariffs are one of a couple of tools that are currently on people's minds. As an M&A partner, I find this highly relevant as there's also a natural connection between trade barriers and deal barriers, which in some cases go hand in hand. Following a number of steps taken forward and backwards over the last 2 weeks with respect to Canada and Mexico and the steps taken with respect to China, we thought it's a good moment to hold in and discuss what's expected for Europe and how businesses get prepared and respond to the increasing uncertainties in international trade. So today with our experts from Washington and Brussels, we have Greg Spak and Sara Nordin, who will just discuss the recent developments. Greg and Sara have extensive experience in international trade of collectively more than 40 years, across a wide range of trade-related matters, especially for European corporates. I will now pass the word to Greg and Sara, but before, say thank you to an audience of more than 150 guests across Europe for joining this session. In terms of housekeeping, the presentation will take approximately 30 minutes, and we have reserved 15 minutes, which we are happy to exceed, for Q&A. Questions can be submitted via the webinar functions. Over to you.
Thank you, Tobias, and good afternoon to all of you in Europe, morning to all of you here on the East Coast or in the United States. My name is Greg Spak. I've been a partner here in the Washington office in the trade group for the last 30 years. I think the most of those 40 years that the combined 40 years that Tobias mentioned must be mine, I assume. So, but it's we've been here together at White & Case, and if you for the last 30 years, if you think of that 30-year period, it's a fascinating period from a trade perspective, right? In 1995, 30 years ago, we had some monumental events occur in trade policy. One, of course, being the entry into force of the WTO, the global system for regulating trade, the international agreement that then is implemented into the different countries' national laws in one way or the other. Also in the United States, of course, we had sort of the NAFTA agreement come into full force around the same time. And if you think of those two things, you can see that they were part of a trend that we all thought would continue for quite a while. That is, a trend started after World War II in which tariffs were liberalized over time, and they would be liberalized on the basis of a system in which non-discrimination and a bound or capped tariff would be the two core principles of the tariff policy. But as we recap what's happened so far in the United States in the first few weeks of the new administration, we see a sort of a questioning of this. And it, as Tobias said, it really goes beyond tariffs. And it all started with this notion on January 20th, the day that the administration took over. There was a memorandum that was called the America First Trade Policy. So if you haven't done it and you're interested in the subject, I encourage you to read this. Because it is much more than tariffs. It identifies no fewer than 13 issues in which the president directs the various agencies of the U.S. government to study and report back by April 1st on a number of issues, a number of problems that he and his administration see as challenges for the United States at this point in time. Some of those I've listed here. The persistent trade deficit, very high on the agenda. I think it was the first in this memorandum of things that he wants his agencies to think about. Then identifying unfair trade practices, that's always in the mix when we speak about trade policy. Expanding the Buy America rules, of course, this is another thing that every country seems to put on its trade agenda at some point. Of course, there are international disciplines for that too, but it's always something that that policymakers put on their list. Of course, evaluating the trade relationship with China, which really I'd say the evaluation hasn't stopped for the last several years. It's been ongoing, but the president would like to intensify that. The use of Section 232, and for those of you not steeped in this, this is the national security law, let's say, which allows the president very wide discretion in terms of taking actions that are necessary in his or her judgment to protect the national security of the United States. There are also some discussions of foreign tax practices. Those of you who watch President Trump know that he's not a fan of the way the international tax system works, or I should say the national tax systems in different trading partners, and he believes that it very much is to the detriment of the United States. And so he's referenced a provision of law that would allow the United States to have punitive taxes on companies from countries that he believes discriminate against U.S. companies and their taxing policies. And he's also taken a step away from the OECD agreements on Pillars 1 and 2. And then finally, he has asked for a review of the Biden administration actions on sanctions, that is economic sanctions, export controls, CFIUS to a certain extent, and also this notion of an outbound investment security program. So I would say to you that basically every aspect of U.S. trade policy is sort of under review in this period, and the review period's not long. If you think about April 1st, it's right around the corner, and these are complex issues, right? So you tend to think that maybe their minds are already made up before studying it, but maybe they're putting the finishing touches on what we all believe to be their views in these different areas. So interestingly, though, there were promises of tariffs being imposed on the first day of the new administration. That did not happen, but tariffs were referenced 5 times in this memorandum, this presidential memorandum of the America First trade policy. And you could see how tariffs will be used in pursuit of these different objectives and tackling these different problems. So for better or worse, as we go on to the next slide, you can see that tariffs have grabbed the headlines, obviously. Many of these other things are sort of difficult to talk about while they're in review stage or being studied. But tariffs, when you talk about or threaten tariffs, that grabs the headlines. And we've seen quite a flurry of headline grabbing actions, I would say. First, as some of you may or may not have heard, and it happened so quickly that you'd be excused from not knowing this, but the president threatened tariffs against Colombia immediately, and then within a few hours took it off the table as the Colombian president agreed to take some of the Colombian nationals back to Colombia on a military plane. So this was a very discreet issue, but the president wasn't slow to use his tariff authority, or at least threatened tariff authority, to get the Colombian president to come to see things his way. Then, of course, more famously, and this got many more headlines, there was an immediate message about possible tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Very quickly, though, the portion or the threats with respect to Canada and Mexico were put on hold for 30 days, and they were put on hold because both the Canadian and Mexican governments offered some initial steps towards the 2 problems that he had identified in this particular action. And those problems were the constant immigration issue we have on the southern border of the United States with Mexico, and also the fentanyl issue. Of course, the Canadians were perplexed by both of them as a basis for taking action against Canada. But in any event, both countries responded with some initial steps, and the president, on the base of those initial steps, paused the tariff threat for 30 days. He didn't reverse it on China, so those went into place, those additional tariffs. And you almost need a scorecard now to keep track of all the different tariffs that apply to China under the different authorities of U.S. law. There were 301 tariffs. There are these new special tariffs. There's, of course, the regular tariff. So it's getting complicated if you're an importer trying to import products from China, but I guess that's part of the design. Of course, China retaliated against the United States. That went into place. Canada threatened to retaliate, but once President Trump postponed the tariffs against Canada, then Canada postponed the retaliation. And then last week, we saw a few other issues come up with tariffs again grabbing the headlines. Section 232, the national security provision that I mentioned before, the measures on steel and aluminum were modified with an effective date of March 12th. But there are some immediate effects and some immediate changes to that program. First of all, that program, and for those of you not steeped in this, this was during the first Trump administration. There was a national security review of steel and aluminum imports, and that led to several measures, primarily a 25% tariff, but also quotas for some countries. Australia was excluded altogether. The system evolved into tariff rate quotas from Europe for products coming from Europe. And then aluminum was generally subject to a 10% tariff. But the other thing that happened in that program is that a number of exclusions were granted. So individual companies and importers could come to the U.S. government and say, look, I need this product. I can't get it from a U.S. producer. Give me an exclusion. And that exclusion system grew to the point where some would say it undermined the program completely. So the first thing that happened in this new announcement last week is the exclusion process is essentially done. It's terminated. So here you can see the administration taking the view that, look, if this policy is going to work, we have to have no exclusions. At least that's the position as of now. Also, the different arrangements with different countries were changed. Everything's now a 25% tariff on both steel and aluminum. And then there's this notion of derivatives, that is downstream products from steel. I think what the administration saw the first time, and the reason we had an exclusion process, was that if you put a tariff on basic steel products, then it sort of hurts the downstream manufacturers in the United States, whose raw material or inputs of steel and aluminum have now become more expensive. So it drove some investment to go out of the United States so that the downstream products could be produced there and imported. Now the answer is, well, we're going to include in the tariff those downstream or derivative products. So in other words, as we go to the next slide, we can see that tariffs are back, right? And this is kind of shocking to those of us who are of my age and in my experience. We all thought tariffs were on their way out, and trade in general was on a path towards liberalization through these successive rounds of trade negotiations. We all thought that they would be bound at their negotiated rates, and that in general they would be applied on a non-discriminatory basis. That's the way tariffs have worked traditionally. Now remember, though, there were always these preferential trade agreements like the CAFTA, the NAFTA, several other free trade agreements, which themselves were an exception to this non-discrimination principle and MFN principle. But the idea was that they were supposed to be preferential and trade liberalizing. And then, of course, you've always had special tariffs like anti-dumping and anti-subsidies, but those were exceptions that proved the rule. The rule being tariffs were supposed to become less and less meaningful. But that changed, we know, during the first Trump administration. And frankly, President Biden's administration didn't change that. He maintained the tariffs for the most part. So what we see very clearly now is that President Trump seems intent on keeping his promise to use tariffs even more in the second term. And these initial moves, interestingly, came against countries who thought they had this type of preferential trading agreement with the United States, and Colombia, Canada, and Mexico. And then, of course, China is a separate issue. So finally, on tariffs, I would just say, as we go to the next slide, we have to think about what is next and who is next. Right? At the very end of last week, we had another presidential order talking about, or presidential memorandum talking about reciprocal tariffs. And this is going to be more studies and reviews, but basically those studies and reviews that are coming back on April 1st, the president has now directed the agencies to look at those and make policy recommendations to get to his view of what the correct answer is, which is reciprocal tariffs. If Europe has a 10% tariff on US cars and we have a 2% tariff, he wants to raise ours to 10, for example. So this is the idea, and what's supposed to be happening after these studies come back on April 1st. The soon to be named Commerce Secretary in an interview said that they may be ready on April 2nd to go forward. So it seems to me that they've already studied these things and have a sense of what direction they're going. And we've also seen that this notion of non-discriminatory treatment is sort of out, right? At least with this administration, at least so far now. He's threatened tariffs against groups of countries, individual countries, and certain sectors. The BRICS countries, they tend to get some unfavorable mentions in terms of what the tariffs would be. The UK, on the other hand, the president has said he's not really happy with it, but he's given some sense that there might potentially be a free trade agreement with the UK in the future. And then there's been the selective treatment of different sectors such as auto, steel, aluminum, so forth. And finally, and germane to our discussion here, the EU. He's said some pretty interesting things about the European Union. I put them here on the screen. For those of you who can't see it, he said we have a trade deficit of 350 billion. They don't take our cars, they don't take our farm products, they don't take anything, and so we're not going to have it with them either. And he said that the tariffs in Europe are coming pretty soon. The European Union has treated us so terribly, and that's so there's plenty of rhetoric suggesting that those moves and policy statements that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, that they will sort of turn towards Europe in the near future. And with that, I'll turn to Sara to talk a little bit about what that means for the impact and response from Europe.
Thanks, Greg. So hi, my name is Sara Nordin. I'm a partner at White & Case based here in Brussels. I have actually 20 years of tariff experience, Greg. So I do contribute to that 40 years, and starting in the United States and then moving over to Europe. So it's really interesting to see, especially being part of perhaps that generation of trade lawyers that have really relied on the international trading system that was set up and the rules that governments are supposed to adhere to, and that now perhaps being questioned and thrown into question and broadened in various ways in terms of the different mechanisms and responses and so on. So looking at Europe and trying to predict the unpredictable, essentially, before we know exactly what's coming, but just bearing in mind what Greg has just reviewed on the US side. What do we expect when it comes to impact on EU businesses? And we just wanted to highlight a few key points here, also in light of all the headlines that you're seeing in the media and in the news around this. So impact on EU businesses, obviously, with the wide range of potential tools, with the impact that tariffs can have on companies, depending on whether you're a direct exporter to the US or whether you are an exporter, whether you're manufacturing in the EU, if we're looking specifically at the EU, or if you have a manufacturing footprint outside of the EU, just looking at how these different tariff measures, for example, could be imposed. It can really the impact that EU businesses will feel will really depend on that. So also looking at if you're an investor in a company, for example, what exactly is the company doing in that respect, and where is it placed in the market with respect to these tariffs? So that's an interesting part to look at. We see also a lot of EU companies that are exporting to US affiliates, which puts them in a different position compared to, for example, an EU company that is exporting to non-affiliated customers. Looking specifically at the tariffs and how they can impact EU exporters, I just wanted to pick up on a few points from what Greg highlighted and what we've seen in the tariffs so far. In that, and especially putting my customs lawyer hat on, really important to know what the products are and what the tariff lines are. So you know that products are divided in the tariff schedule into various categories. And there will be specific tariff lines that are targeted. There will be certain exclusions, as Greg highlighted. So really important to know what the products are. Then, as Greg also highlighted, there are various levels of import duties. There is now the consideration of raising the standard tariff that the US imposes on products. But what you also had on the steel front were additional duties being imposed on top of the standard duty. So just taking into account that there are different types of duties and the impact that all these various layers of duties can have. Then another customs concept that becomes really important in this context, and that we've seen from the announcement so far, is knowing what is the origin of your product. Because surprisingly, perhaps to some, the duties are not imposed based on where the product is exported from. It's imposed on the basis of the origin of the product. And we know that especially here in the EU, this might be less of a focus of EU companies because you're not forced to know, for example, for labeling purposes in the EU, exactly where your product is originating from. However, if you're trading a product, as that product is imported, as a trader, you're expected to state where exactly that product originates from. And this is the information that will be key in order to determine if tariffs are imposed and what the impact might be. And then I just want to pick up on a point that Greg just made in terms of it's not just tariffs. Keep in mind, also as we're dealing with issues relating to sanctions and export controls, investment reviews, public procurement rules, and things like that, that this could easily be broadened to encompass a wide variety of things besides tariffs, and the impact that that can have on EU businesses as they are investing in the US, as they are selling products to the US, the potential pressure as we're looking at these negotiations and talks and so on going forward of coordinating various policies, pressure on the EU to perhaps reshape its policies when it comes to these mechanisms. So just to keep that in mind as well. And we can go to, the next slide, just to look at some of the potential EU responses. And this is mainly to pick up on some of the headlines that we're seeing. What will the EU do in retaliation or in response to what the US might be doing? And there are various theories around this. It's very difficult to know how this is going to play out. We see in the news this week that the EU is having certain talks with the US administration to see, for example, could generally, something that has been floated in the media, could the EU lower its car tariffs to appease any criticism about the EU actually having tariffs that are very high on cars? There, we're looking at very specific products and the potential response in that regard. So it's difficult to know if that is actually realistic, that will be a specific measure. There is a lot of attention in the media to this new instrument because a common criticism of the EU is that it's not always quick to respond when it comes to these types of retaliation or reciprocal measures. It usually takes the EU several months, for example, to impose what we've seen safeguard duties, which has been imposed in the steel context. But also, if we look at the second bullet point, these rebalancing tariffs that the EU actually set in place back in 2018 in response on specific US products. That has been suspended for the time being, and that suspension period does expire at the end of March. So there is a lot of attention on that, whether that could be something that the EU could perhaps respond with more quickly. It's difficult to say. It depends on how these talks unfold. So if we go back to this anti-coercion instrument, just to briefly look at that, it's a new instrument that the EU has put in place. There's a big menu of potential countermeasures that the EU could impose if it considers that a country like the US is engaging in coercion. The tricky part with EU decisions is, as usual, at least a qualified majority is required. and there are various procedures that this needs to undergo before a decision can be made. So there are various predictions. It would take at least 8 weeks. It's difficult to say how quickly that could come into force as well. Then when we look at all these other theories, just to briefly mention that there are these theories about whether the EU could promise to purchase certain products, such as gas, defense products, and so on. Difficult to see how that's going to play out as well. Will the EU branch out and look at other measures than tariffs, such as digital services taxes, financial services restrictions, and so on, especially as we see this broadening where it's not necessarily tariffs for tariffs in the responses. It's feasible, but it's really difficult to say at this point. So with that, we wanted to take a look at, if we go to the next few slides, what could EU businesses do to prepare? Again, difficult to predict, but I will pass over to Greg to give at least a few highlights in that regard.
Thank you, Sarah. So interesting, and before we talk about, in order to talk about what the company should do, we have to recognize that a lot of it depends on what the governments do, right? So on the government level, and we realize that maybe companies don't have the same potential to influence as they used to. At least those are the initial indications. But there's a basic issue. Do you deal, or does your government deal with the United States, or do you retaliate? I mean, that's a very, very clear division, and it seems to make a difference, right? So what's been fascinating to see in the first few weeks is that the problems that the Trump administration has identified as justifying tariffs, trade deficits, exchange rates, illicit drug trade, immigration, these are all long-term problems. It's not reasonable to expect that we're going to put a tariff on and just wait till those problems are solved and then take it off. So it's interesting that they've picked longer-term problems and then used short-term tariff threats to get people to the table, or to impose the tariffs, hoping to have some impact. But it's interesting because it doesn't seem to be a measure that is really calibrated to solve long-term problems. And so far, the Trump administration seems to be willing to postpone tariff action in return for at least some steps forward. That's certainly what we saw in the case of Canada and Mexico. Of course, nobody pretends that Canada and Mexico solved the immigration and solved the fentanyl problem, and because of that, President Trump postponed the tariffs. Instead, it was this initial progress and initial postponement of the tariffs. The problem with this is, of course, that it likely leads to successive threats. Every time there's frustration on the side of the United States with the pace of progress, or the progress that's actually being made, we expect then that these tariff threats are going to come back, and that's not a very good way to set the conditions for a healthy relationship in terms of international commerce. Now, on the company level, it seems inevitable that there's some basic hygiene that everybody has to get involved in, right? Because you've got to prepare for these tariffs. They appear to be things that will be part of your lives for the next several years in one way or the other, either dealing with the threat or dealing with the actual tariffs, and also the other issues such as the changes that might occur in CFIUS, Buy America, sanctions, and the tariffs generally. So as we speak about tariffs, some of the things that we've seen in the first few weeks that is really sort of basic things, but they've fallen into sort of disrepair, I would say, because tariff levels generally were so low. So some very basic things like reviewing your contracts with your U.S. counterparts. Who has the tariff burden contractually? What do your Incoterms say? And sometimes those things are not consistent. And we've had a lot of questions the first few weeks about, well, my Incoterms say I'm selling DDP, but on the other hand, I have a contract that says that the purchaser is going to pay for the tariffs. How do we get this in order? What should happen? What's possible? What's not possible? And how do you do it? So, and again, it seems almost a basic issue to mention, but when tariffs were zero, nobody really cared that much. All right. Now, valuation becomes a very specific issue that, again, people have stopped paying much attention to because Valuation wasn't considered to be that significant of an issue when tariffs were zero. And what do I mean by valuation? Well, when a product comes to the border and has to enter, you have to state a value. The importer has to state a value, and it has an obligation to say that the value is accurate. Now, when tariffs were zero, and that value is the tariff base, right? The base to which the tariff is applied. When tariffs are zero or very low, importers didn't really care. They often took the invoice price, and they ignored things that you can deduct from the invoice price, like a DDP contract. You'll have insurance and freight and other things in the on the invoice, and those are called non-dutiable charges. So when we get to the point of imposing 25% tariffs, you better pay attention to what's non-dutiable, and you have to start looking at the valuation issues more carefully. You'll also have to make sure that you're coordinating with your tax advisors, right? Because there are implications, especially if you have affiliated importers, as to what the transfer pricing policy is, and making sure that you're acting in accordance with both the complying with the tax rules and the customs rules. It is possible to do both correctly, but it's often done incorrectly when people don't think about it and plan properly. Finally, I'd say stay close to your U.S. customers. Here, you're going to have negotiations about how you continue your business together. Some of them may have to start looking for other suppliers. You obviously want to prevent that from happening if you're an exporter to the United States, and you might want to incentivize those customers to get involved politically with the administration to see if maybe an exception or exclusion policy may emerge in the future as the tariffs build up some pressure in the United States. So now all of this is if you're an exporter to the United States. What about those companies who are investing in companies in the United States? Private equity houses and other companies just investing in production and other facilities in the United States. You've got to really take another look at the target and understand the target's exposure to all of these rules. Tariffs, certainly. Valuation issues within their tariff exposure, but also sanctions by America. Do these companies have contracts that might not continue under the emerging Buy America rules if they're tightened? Or is there going to be more of a CFIUS analysis done? Now, on this point, it's interesting, right? You would think that the CFIUS policy ought to be more relaxed if the objective is to drive more investment into the United States so that more production occurs here. But we've already seen a few anomalous examples in which investors that typically were welcome to the United States are having problems now. Again, this notion of the identity of the investor somehow becoming more important in the national security context. So if you're making financial investments in the United States, you want to pay a lot of attention to the trade aspects of the targets and your investments to make sure that you understand the risk that could be more significant now in this evolving tariff and America's first trade policy as it becomes implemented. So with that, let me go back over to Sara to put in some of her thoughts from the European perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at especially these diligence and supply chain aspects, because not just for companies that are exporting these products, but also for, as Greg highlighted, companies that are investors in these companies. It becomes really important to know what supply chains are and to perform diligence in relation to that. We already mentioned the concept of origin and knowing exactly where products are considered to originate. There are overarching rules for that, but those rules can vary depending on exactly what country you're looking at. So origin rules can be different in the EU, for example, compared to the origin rules in the US. But what's key in that context is to really know what the supply chains look like, and whether there are, for example, preferential tariffs that you could draw from in that respect. And as Greg has also mentioned, less attention has been paid to that when tariffs are low to begin with. But now perhaps preferential tariffs take on a different role as the standard tariffs go up. Then just looking at the EU landscape when it comes to knowing supply chains and diligence, we would just note that there has been a considerable push on the EU side in the past 5 years, especially in learning about supply chains, knowing who your suppliers are, what are the parties in the supply chain, and that's for various reasons. Since 2022, because of the Russia sanctions, a lot of EU companies have had to learn a lot about their supply chains because they have to make sure, for example, if you're in the steel industry, that you don't have inputs from Russian manufacturers, and that has to be declared as products are being imported into the EU. You have other instruments as well that are pushing this trend towards knowing your supply chain, like the deforestation regulation when it comes to specific products and CBAM, for example. So sure, that is targeting specific industry sectors, but there is a general trend because of these different trade compliance tools that companies are expected to know what their supply chains are. And that could be utilized in this context as well. You're better prepared when you know exactly where your products are coming from. And especially looking at what is the potential flexibility in the supply chains that you are utilizing. If you have a footprint that is not just in one country for manufacturing, that makes you more flexible as these tools are unraveled and so on. So just important to think about these things. It's difficult to predict, but with that information, it makes you better equipped for potential rapid response if you do have these elements in place and know them well. So just going to the next slide to very quickly pick up on a couple of things that Greg already mentioned, but it's really important to highlight on the EU side as well, because it does really show a lot of the questions that we are getting at the moment. So really important to look at cost and contract elements, how things are allocated. We already mentioned Incoterms, so that is how the exporter versus the importer, to simplify, divides the responsibilities. That can vary between industry sectors, how that usually is divided, but there's nothing keeping exporters, for example, from negotiating as to how that could be changed. So just to keep that in mind, that what has always been in place doesn't necessarily have to be in place in the future. So just looking at that. When it comes to, for example, larger projects, does it have to be a big project with a supply chain or a supply that spans over many, many years, giving less flexibility in terms of the supply? That could be something that's important to look at as well, and how you allocate the responsibilities when it comes to the supply. And Greg already picked up on the customs valuation element, also important for purposes of intra-company sales. Within company groups, companies can have very specific valuation methods in how they value their products. Could be a good time to look at that, exactly how that value is determined, which is often very much driven by tax rules. But it's important to look at it from a customs perspective for this purpose as well. So with that, over and back to Greg, just for some final words. And I guess just to remind people that we're happy to take questions. So there is a Q&A box to pop potential questions into. So please feel free to do that while Greg closes the presentation with some final words. Greg, you're on mute. Sorry.
The final words here are turbulence, uncertainty, and of course, both arise from this potential for retaliation. It's frankly going to be tough to plan for business as usual over the next several months to years. And the big question, of course, it's on everybody's mind: is this really a change in direction, or is it a temporary detour? I don't think anybody can tell you the answer to that just yet. And unfortunately, you're going to have to implement some of these changes and do some of these reviews on the assumption that that it could be well. First of all, it's going to probably affect your short term, and it may just very well affect your medium to long term also. But I think most people believe that the U.S.-EU trade relationship has to survive in a positive way. It's never been easy. There have always been issues, as you would expect from two large markets, and it's had to bend from time to time, but it really hasn't broken. So we don't think we're going to see a break. The two economic powers here are going to have to find a way to allow their businesses to continue to engage in international trade, which has led, frankly, to a lot of prosperity in both areas. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tobias and hopefully have some good questions from everyone.
Okay, we have the first three questions coming in, and I'll start with one, which is maybe the most obvious one. Is all of this legal? And if not, is anyone going to challenge it and able to put a stop on what's currently happening?
Well, I'll start there. As usual, I'm a lawyer, so I have to say it's not clear, right, to a certain extent. But look, let's say what the intent, certainly the intent of all the international agreements, and both on the multilateral level and the preferential trading agreements, the intent is to lower tariffs and to open markets and to create a more liberalized trading system. And as I said, it's no accident that these two basic principles of non-discrimination and a cap on tariffs, those are literally Articles 1 and 2 of the GATT and the WTO agreement. So we're not talking about ancillary issues. These are the main issues. Now, of course, there is a way. Every trade agreement has an exception for national security, right? Every trade agreement has other exceptions that allow countries to take action when necessary to protect against some vital interests. So those are parts of every trade agreement, including the WTO and the several free trade agreements. So I'm sure we'll see defenses saying, yes, I'm still committed to liberalized trade, but I've got these problems and I'm permitted to invoke one of the exceptions. That's what we've seen to date, and I expect we'll see more of that. The other thing I found interesting is, we could all just renegotiate our tariffs. There is in the WTO and in most free trade agreements a mechanism to have a new negotiation if the United States feels that the process begun in 1945 and 47 has gone awry and it no longer represents where we ought to be. We could have a renegotiation. That, of course, takes a long time. Could be, you could imagine how long that process could take, and that doesn't seem to be a good tool for the United States right now. Have people challenged, and could they challenge? Yes. China has already requested consultations in response to the first action by the Trump administration. We'll see. It goes back to that slide that I mentioned before. Do you retaliate? Do you oppose, or you just try to negotiate your way through this? I think we'll see the different countries have different responses over time.
Excellent. Just moving on, and I see a lot of questions coming in specifically on steel and aluminium, but I also see questions coming in on IP licensing and sales of services, which I think is another fascinating area. But before going to that, there was reference in press about value-added tax in Europe. So how is that going to be put into the equation? And is there going to be a focus on just comparing those types of taxes?
So I think we've been trying to assess what exactly does that mean and how will it play out. And I can see that the EU has already tried to issue a response to that potential. The EU is that it's not an unfair system because it's a system that applies equally on consumption of products in the EU. So it applies both to products that are produced in the EU as well as products that are imported. And that would be the distinction. There is some confusion because as an importer in the EU, you would pay the VAT upon import. So there is usually a concept that says import VAT as you're importing a product, which is paid along with the tariff. However, that VAT, then the idea is that gets passed on, and it's the end consumer that will essentially pay for it. I understand that what has been pointed out is that if you are an EU exporter, of course you don't have to pay the VAT because the product is not consumed in the EU. So I understand that that is the criticism and why that might be considered an unfair advantage for EU, especially in light of the VAT rates being quite high in the EU, an unfair advantage for EU producers. But that is the discussion that I'm expecting for that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay. I leave it to you to choose the next one. I'm very interested to hear about this licensing and sale of services, but you choose your priorities.
I think it's mainly for Greg. You can see the questions, Greg?
Yes, I can. So let me go quickly. I think I could deal with the first two. So these are about the steel derivatives products. And so the question is, when will we know the exact list of steel derivative products that are subject to the 25% tariff? That's one. And the other is similar. But let me take the first one first. So this came out actually last week. If you hadn't seen it, when you look at the Federal Register, there's a way you can see what's coming out the next day, and it came out on Friday in that advanced section. So if you need it, you can contact us or just look at if you search for the Federal Register, the presidential announcements, it came out. It's quite extensive. It's much more extensive than the derivatives list before. And again, to put this in context, what's going on here? The idea was initially the 25% would be on steel tariff would be tariffs imposed on steel products, generally the basic steel products. But of course, people producing those downstream products in the United States were disadvantaged. So the notion this time is to include those downstream products so that the downstream producers in the United States are not disadvantaged. So that list is now out. And it's in the Federal Register. I believe you'll see it published today because yesterday was a federal holiday here in the United States. Now, on the second one, so the question is that CBP should provide a procedure to measure the steel and aluminum content within the derivative products. Is there any precedent for such a procedure? Is this even workable? I don't think it's going to work exactly like that. I think the notion is there's a procedure that's being announced. So we have the derivatives list that's going to be published probably today. And you can see the vast list of derivative products that are included. But then there's also a new procedure, not for customs to analyze and these issues, but for different US companies to come forward and propose that new products be added to the derivatives list. And that's the procedure that was mentioned in the president's proclamation. So you can almost think of it as the reverse of the exclusion process that we all lived with, right? So before we had it's imposed on all steel products, and if you really needed the product to be imported, you could go ask for an exclusion. Now that we're expanding it downstream to derivatives, the administration is going to say, now if you see something that we missed, come tell us and we'll add it also. But it's not customs that's doing this at the border. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator. We do have
and there's more. The good news is there's more questions coming in, and the better news is all the participants seem to stay in touch and keep interested. So we're not losing anyone on the way. So what about IP licensing and sales? Do you expect any movement there?
So let me start here. I don't see the precise. Oh, I see. Do you anticipate tariffs on IP licensing or sales of services? So look, generally speaking, tariffs are on goods, right? They're on goods, but it's a little more complicated than that in the sense that there are certain circumstances in which a product, in which the IP licensing or royalties are a condition of sale of the product of the good that's crossing the border. And in those cases, there are very technical valuation rules that essentially say that if the IP licensing or the royalty is a condition of sale of the product, then the amount paid in that licensing has to be apportioned to the value of the product. So that valuation issue that I talked about before, it's already been a basic concept of customs law that in certain circumstances, the product that's the value of the product stated at the border has to already include an apportioned amount for the licensing or royalties. Technical rules on when that's the case and when it's not, but in terms of the question, do we anticipate tariffs just on IP licensing or just on sales of services? We would say no.
Okay.
There was one question about when there is a discrepancy between delivery terms in terms of who's paying tariffs, but contract language that says that somebody else is responsible for the payment of tariffs. And there I would just note that it very much depends on, and that's why it's important to do these contract reviews. It really depends on the language in the contract, how you would manage that and the assessment there as to who exactly is responsible. It's and that is why we highlighted contract reviews, because these discrepancies suddenly you might detect them and they create very interesting scenarios.
Let me come back to, there's a follow-up question on the one that I answered regarding the derivatives list and specifically for aluminum. So the listener is pointing out and pointing to some a specific reference in the text, suggesting, as he says, importers of aluminum derivative articles shall provide to CBP any information necessary to identify the aluminum content used in the manufacturing, and that CBP is hereby authorized and directed to publish regulations. So look, I think let's separate two things. Three things. One is the list that came out initially. It's clearly only an initial list. And the second step is that there will be additional items that we can anticipate being added after a petition from US producers. So that's step one, initial list. Step two, this ongoing process for additional products. But yes, of course, you can imagine at any given time when a good arrives at the border, it's not going to be very clear necessarily on the basis of the documents or a visual inspection of the product, whether this product fits in the derivative, in the definition of the derivative product or not. So of course, just like any time you have an entry at the border, there could be exchanges of information, and customs is going to have to make these determinations. Will it bog things down at the border? Sure. But remember also that the way the system works in the United States is, goods generally enter as declared, right? And then the US government has about 11 months to figure out whether it was declared and entered properly. So what happens during those 11 months and during this, what's called a liquidation cross period, is that the Customs Service can put out requests for more information. It can look at it and determine that it already knows the answer and do what's called a rate advance. So I don't expect, even though this language sounds sort of ominous and cumbersome, I'm not sure that it's all that different than what happens at the border every day when there are close calls. I think it's wrong to think that the Customs Board is going to sit there and all of a sudden change their basic notion that things enter and then are reviewed later. I think that will continue. We might see a lot more interesting reviews going on and requests for information, but it shouldn't change the daily flow of products all that much.
Okay, with that, I remain impressed by the number of participants who are holding on to us, but I would suggest we'll come to a close. Needless to say that today's speakers and also our global trade experts who are all on this page and with whom also the M&A representative on this call works together on a frequent basis are definitely approachable to respond to any needs you will have, and we'll be very happy to engage with you. So with that, thank you very much for a very engaged audience, and we look forward to being in touch. Thank you.